Hello and Privyet. Welcome back, tubers and connoisseurs, to collectrussia.com. Today we have our friend Igor Moiseyev. What do we have today?
Interesting subject. Three medals that are important medals for Soviet World War II campaigns, defending the motherland. And neither of the three is very well known. And it also represents a huge value to collectors. So we'll discuss the medals, we'll discuss variations of those medals, and some very unexpected oddities that are mostly unknown to vast majority of collectors in the United States, at least. I think these are important to know because you may be able to find those things if you know what you're looking for. And they are rarities and they are of great interest to collectors. We'll discuss what led to the introduction of the medals, why they're important, and also how many were issued. As I mentioned, they are fairly inexpensive. They represent tremendous value. And the medals in particular are Medal for the Defense of Caucasus, Medal for the Defense of Soviet Arctic region, and finally, Medal for the Defense of Kiev. How they came about, when, how many were awarded approximately, and so forth. Also important.
Very nice. Very nice. All right, you have some examples for us today, I assume.
Sure. Let's start with the first one, which would be, in my opinion, important to know and maybe the best value in Soviet campaign medals, other than maybe very hugely, those issued in very huge numbers for victory over Japan, victory over Germany. The ones for defending or capturing a city or a geographic area. There is no better value than the Medal for the Defense of Caucasus, and also one of the very important medals. It got eclipsed by large by a campaign that everybody, of course, knows about, and that's the Battle of Stalingrad. The two battles took place at approximately the same time. Battle of Caucasus unfolded over a much longer period, but it was nevertheless extremely important. Goebbels, one of the Hitler's main cronies and chief of propaganda, claimed that it was Hitler's idea to attack Caucasus early on, to capture it and thus deny the Soviet Union use of naval bases in the Black Sea, and also to strangle Soviet Union by denying access to oil. All the oil at that time that Soviet Union produced was coming from that area, from the Caucasus, from Baku region in particular. And it was the generals who thought otherwise and thwarted this and therefore concentrated on Moscow, and as we now know, it was a disaster. So he was bemoaning this fact that generals didn't listen to the Führer, who was a genius. We don't know if it's true or not. What we do know for fact is that it's a very important area, and the struggle took for forever, you could say, from 1942, the same time as the start of the Battle of Stalingrad, as the German Blau offensive. Part of the German troops veered to the south, trying to score some quick victories. It never quite came the way they wanted, and eventually they had to retreat. But even their retreat took a much longer time than Stalingrad, so it was a very protracted campaign. It took months and months. The way it started was with the German Blau offensive, and even looking a little bit back, taking a few steps back, what was the state of affairs on the Eastern Front at that point? We know that Germans in 1941 scored some quick victories, some important victories, decimated the Soviet troops that were assembled near the border by large, especially the center of the front, Army Group Center, made the biggest progress, destroyed much of the Soviet armored troops, much of the Soviet paratrooper corps was gone by the end of 1941, and it was just literally by the skin of their teeth that Soviets were able to hold the Germans at the doorstep of Moscow and throw them back 100 or so miles, and were able to continue the war. Later, Soviets got very emboldened. Stalin was expecting the Germans were at the end of their rope, and he was really hoping to score decisive victories in as early as 1942. Soviet propaganda actually claimed that 1942 would be the last year of the war. They in many ways calculated correctly, because Germans did not have the resources of the Soviet Union, not nearly in terms of manpower, in terms of even production facilities. By late 42, American and British supplies, or by late 41 and early 42, American and British supplies were finally pouring in to the Soviet Union. So that gave a major boost. And Soviet Union was able, by that point, to relocate war industries into the Soviet interior. Factories that were in the German zone of occupation or immediately exposed to German bombing were largely relocated into Siberia or southern parts of the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, for example, and Ural Mountains, and restarted production. By 42, it was all appearing very hopeful to Stalin and his generals. And in the follow-up to the Battle of Moscow, there was a major effort, again, not very well known, perhaps, which was Soviet general offensive on all fronts, and specifically against Army Group Center, which Soviets were hoping to destroy there and then. They did try major encirclements. You've probably heard of places like Demyansk pocket, where a large group of German troops was actually in a pocket. Hitler and his chief of aviation, Goering, were able to accomplish a supply of those troops. And that's what actually doomed them later on at Stalingrad, because he was hoping that he could repeat this achievement again. So the encirclement itself didn't cause the necessary alarm, perhaps, when it happened at Stalingrad. But initially they were successful. So they did resupply their troops by using their dominance in the air. They did beat off early Soviet attempts at breaking the Army Group Center, and there were many troops involved, a lot of partisans. There was a major effort on Soviet parts that Soviets, you could say, lost. So the tail end of the Battle of Moscow, what happened afterwards immediately in early 1942, was pretty unsuccessful for the Soviet side. There were major efforts in many areas. None of them really came to fruition. Leningrad was still encircled, so attempts to relieve it did not bring anything other than a huge number of war dead. There was an effort in the center that you may have heard of, Rzhev meat grinder, that would be repeated a number of times, led to absolutely nothing. And Germans majorly recovered from this initial shock of Russian winter and Soviet pretty successful counteroffensive initially, and started pushing again. And in 1942, one of these parts of the German effort was the so-called Second Battle of Kharkov, where Soviets tried to once again counterattack, made a major effort. There were several armies involved and at least 2 rank corps on the Soviet side. Initially, they achieved penetration of German lines, but then the inferiority in communications, in tactics, and especially the air dominance of the Germans had a major impact, and all the troops that broke through near Kharkov to the south of Kharkov got cut off, got absolutely destroyed, got into a major, and that was a humongous defeat for the Soviet Union. You don't read much of it, much about it in, of course, Soviet history books or any history books, but it was a very, very major catastrophe for the war, for the Soviet war machine. And then on the heels of that misfortune came German advance in Crimea. If you remember, Soviets counterattacked there too, were able to recapture an important part on the eastern side of Crimea. Germans took that part back. So again, Sevastopol was still being besieged, and it was in more dire straits now, because Germans were at the doorstep of the Caucasus now. This recapturing of the eastern part of Crimea, they were able to cross, potentially, and eventually that's what they did, to cross this very narrow isthmus where Crimean bridges, the infamous Crimean bridges, stands now. There was no bridge at that time, but it's still a pretty short distance into Kuban region, which is the beginning of Caucasus area, overall geographic area. So it was again a serious defeat. For the Soviets that were supposedly well prepared, they knew Germans were about to attack. They built at least 3 major lines of fortifications. Germans were able to fool them with tactics, used some combat engineers to circumvent those defenses using rubber boats, literally. Next came the defeat in Sevastopol. Sevastopol was completely blockaded. There was no longer any reliable means of getting supplies there because Germans and Romanians who were helping them took total dominance of the Black Sea. They were able to get Stauboats, the German speedboats there. There was a very active Italian, believe it or not, and Navy active in the Sevastopol region. So no ship could really sneak through without risking being sunk, and quite a number of Black Sea fleet ships and submarines were sunk by Luftwaffe or by German Navy. So Sevastopol fell soon afterwards. So like dominoes, Soviet positions one after another fell, and greatly emboldened Hitler and his generals, they undertook a new major campaign that was supposed to take the Soviet Union either out of the war completely or at least relegated to very little kind of front of second importance. They were still setting their eyes on Britain. They knew that this was a major adversary. This was the only country that was able to stand to them prior to Soviet Union's involvement and Americans' involvement in the war. Britain was the only one fighting. So their major goal was to sideline Soviet Union, to make it impossible for the Americans to join by taking over South Africa, northern part of Africa, Cyrenaica, and so forth, Libya, Egypt, strangling British supply lines by cutting the Suez Canal. So that was the grandiose plan. And for that, in order to get again into possibly launching a campaign against Britain, the naval landing, which they always thought of, it was necessary to take the Soviet Union out of the war. And they were hoping to achieve that with their new summer campaign of 1942. So July 1942, major new forces, newly equipped, young, you could say, German troops, new generation of German troops, reconstituted German army after losses of Moscow, pours into the southern part of the Soviet Union. Now, Germans are not able at that point to conduct a major offensive everywhere. So they're not advancing in Leningrad, that's a stalemate. They are just content with bombarding the city and strangling it. And the stranglehold, by the way, at that point is not as tough as it was in the beginning, because Russians were able to finally set up some lines of supply for the city, even though it's still blockaded. In the center, it's very inconclusive. Back and forth, Soviets are trying to attack, never successful, but Germans are not able, don't have the manpower to make any major advances either. And in the south is where the major effort takes place. And that major effort was codenamed by the German side as Operation Blau, which initially was supposed to have 4 stages. There was stage 1, attack towards Voronezh, crossing the Don Dnieper, then advancing further, capturing Rostov-on-Don. That was a prerequisite. That was very important. This is where they suffered some of their very early setbacks in the previous year's campaign, before Moscow battle even. And then eventually getting to Stalingrad. That was only stage 3. Stalingrad was at that point in their planning was of no particular importance. And then finally, stage 4, Operation Blau 4, would be the advance to the Caucasus, occupying Caucasus area. It developed in some ways faster than Germans expected, because by now Soviet troops learned their lessons. And even though Soviet armies in the south were chewed up, decimated, cut in pieces, to such an extent that I remember reading one award commendation to a pilot, to a dispatch aircraft pilot, whose mission was to simply find the army command. They completely lost any kinds of communications. There was no radio link with the troops. And the central command needed to know where that particular army even located at this point, and give them orders, literally by flying an airplane, trying to find them, landing there, and giving the package with written orders to the commander so they can extricate themselves. Wow. It was that bad.
Wow.
The chaos was complete. However, Soviets had learned their lessons from the early days of the war. They were careful enough to avoid major envelopments. They knew the danger of that. So the envelope, the encirclements the Germans tried to achieve at that point were very shallow. Most of the Soviet troops retreated, but retreated without suffering major losses in personnel. It was important for them at that point. Later, as Stalin's order came that not a step back, it was absolutely forbidden to retreat, but that would come later, at the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, starting from about August 1942. At the same time as those things were unfolding, and Stalingrad now came into crosshair because the advancement was so rapid, the Germans didn't expect it. They actually suffered major logistical problems with their supplying of advancing troops. They didn't have enough gasoline, for example. Never planned for it. There was a infamous, maybe depending on what side you look at from, there was a so-called stampede at Rostov, where Germans got bottlenecked, basically, and there were too many troops trying to use whatever roads were available, and they were on each other's head, basically, and not advancing rapidly enough, again allowing the Soviets to escape. And part of the Soviet armies escaped towards Stalingrad. That's where they took stand. The other part was retreating towards Caucasus. And Hitler, being ever greedy, decided to divide the effort into Army Group B and Army Group A. One army group went after Stalingrad. And the strategic importance of Stalingrad at that point became apparent. Stalingrad is located on the Volga River at the place where it comes very close to the Don River. Both are major rivers. One flows into Caspian Sea, the other into Azov and Black Sea, essentially. And if you control this area in between the rivers, and if you control at least a little bit of the eastern part of Volga, if you have a bridgehead on the Volga, then the entire rest of the Soviet Union is sort of open to you. It's just a step. There are no major obstacle all the way to Urals and Siberia, perhaps, at least in the south. So you can basically envelope Moscow from the south and make it irrelevant by cutting all the railroads, by cutting all ways of supply from the south. It was very important. So that was the plan. The other part of that plan was attack towards Caucasus, and you could say that they chased too many targets at once, overestimated, and suffered for it, deservedly. The point of getting to Caucasus was, first of all, eradicating the remnants of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, which was still very active. It managed to evacuate a lot of people from besieged Sevastopol, a lot of civilians. Some work of art, like, for example, the famous diorama panoramic exhibition of defense of Sevastopol in the previous one, the Crimean War, against French and British and Turks, of all people. It was carefully folded, put together in crates, crated, and evacuated on a cruiser that barely managed to make it there to the southern ports along the shore of the Caucasus, along the western shore of Black Sea, eastern, I should say, shore of Black Sea. It was important for Germans to take care to completely destroy those battleships, whatever Russians had submarines, that few bases that they had, starting with the Novorossiysk and going further up to Tuapse. Those are major naval ports. So that was one purpose. The other one was to get to the sources of oil. At that time, oil that we now know of in Siberia, in Eastern Siberia especially, that is mainstay of Russian economy, and gas, it hadn't been discovered yet. So oil came from the Azerbaijan and specifically Baku area on the Caspian Sea, the other side of Caucasus, the eastern side of Caucasus, and it was of paramount importance. Now, Soviet Union could probably exist to some extent for a while without oil, maybe, but they didn't have anything like Germans later came up with synthetic oil. later in the war. And there were some other sources like Ploiești, North Ploiești and Romanian oil fields. Soviet Union main supply of oil, some existed in Western Ukraine. It had long been overrun by that point by the Germans. And the second major and most important area by far was Azerbaijan. If Germans could get there and actually get use of that oil, start pumping it, oh, they would be in a totally different strategic position because oil was their Achilles foot. It was
heel.
Achilles heel, I should say. Yeah, it was always a problem for the Germans from the start of the war till the end. Few people know that when Soviet Union was essentially an ally of Nazi Germany before Germans attacked in June 1941, Soviet Union was the major supplier of oil for the German war industry. The last railway tankers of oil the Germans got was literally on the same day that they started the invasion. They literally let the train pass through and then they attacked. But without oil, it was very difficult to conduct, for either side to conduct the war. So not only the Germans were hoping of denying oil to the Soviet Union, but also getting a major source of oil that they did not have, not to that extent. So that was second. Thirdly, in general, Caucasus is a verdant area. Some parts of it produce wonderful agricultural products. We talk, for example, about Georgian tea. It doesn't exist anymore, but back then it was a serious supplier of tea leaves. Mandarin oranges, apples, wines. There are some wonderful wines that they produce there. And it's a major wine growing area as well. So Caucasus was important as an agricultural area. Kuban region is where some of the best wheat in Russia is grown to this day. Some best quality wheat comes from there. Grain, very important. And last but perhaps not least, if Germans were successful in capturing Caucasus, guess what lies behind? Turkey. Turkey was seriously considering, it was on the fence at that point. But if Germans were able to clear all the way to the Turkish border, in all likelihood, Turkey would join the war on their side against the Allies. Just like they did in World War I. They were more careful this time. They smartened up. So they didn't immediately join the war, and they remained semi-neutral. In fact, were much more sympathetic to the Germans than Allies. But it's practically a given that they would get into the war. So it would have major implications. So Caucasus, extremely important. Germans didn't get nearly as far as they were hoping. They did capture some important targets. City of Mozdok, for example. They captured Krasnodar. In the Kuban region, they captured all of the Kuban producing area, Kuban Kozak area. They were able to get very deep into the Caucasus. By August, I believe, of 1942, they planted a huge Nazi flag on the top of the main mountain in the Caucasus range, Mount Elbrus. By the way, it took years, I believe, a couple of years, for the Soviets to finally get rid of that flag. But the propaganda was important for both sides. So Germans sent, actually, as soon as they were in the area, they sent a group of mountain climbers to a huge German banner there. Wow. And despite all of that, they were not able to get through the mountain passes. They got very far. They destroyed captured some of the oil-producing areas in northern Caucasus that the Soviets set on fire, so they were of no use. Germans weren't able to get any use out of them. They were never able to get to the number one area of Azerbaijan, never got that far. They were never able to capture any foothold on the Caspian Sea in general. Again, important, at least for the reason that some of the American supplies or British supplies were at that point starting to come, not just from the northern route that many people know about, Murmansk, but also through the southern route, through Persia, modern days Iran. And that was of considerable importance too. They never quite were able to achieve. They had too many goals and never were able to achieve any of the major goals that they had. In late October or so of 1942, their advance had slowed to a crawl. They came very close to capturing Tuapse, but again, in the mountain passes, they got stopped and were never able to advance, despite all of their efforts. And of course, major attention of Wehrmacht and the Soviet High Command at that point was in Stalingrad, which was happening at that same time. In November, the Soviets counterattacked, first very successful major counteroffensive of the war, where Germans actually got into a huge cauldron. Three offensives happened at the same time, one in the north near Leningrad, unsuccessfully. The other one was Demyansk area, not successful either, not by much, Staraya Russa area. And the successful part, which they were actually not putting very much hopes on, was at Stalingrad, where they were able to achieve modern mechanized warfare. And the pincers met famously at Kalach-on-Don. German 6th Army was trapped, and Germans realized that their further effort in the Caucasus at this point was meaningless. If they continued, if they persevered, all they would achieve would be major entrapment of the entire army group. That would be a catastrophe, because they started extricating their troops slowly from the Caucasus area, eventually set up a perimeter, a defensive perimeter in the Kuban area, the so-called Blue Line, where the battle would go on and on and on for months, for a good half a year. Soviets were finally able to break through in late 1943, eventually, and by the cost of colossal losses. And Germans eventually retreated into the Crimea and held on there for more than half a year, until middle of 1944. So that's in a nutshell what happened with the defense. So campaign took a very long time. We are talking from about August of 1942 through well into closer to the end of 1943. The medal for this campaign also got instituted kind of late for a defensive campaign medal. It's 1944 when the medal only appeared for the first time. There were quite a few of them issued simply because of the number of troops, the huge area, huge geographic area that was involved. Very long running campaign, major effort on both sides. And as a result, we have a paradoxical case when a medal was issued in huge numbers, relatively speaking. It's relatively unknown as an area because it got eclipsed by Stalingrad, by Moscow, by more famous places like Leningrad, or later Berlin, the Battle of even Warsaw. Those are better known locations, easier to identify. Caucasus is just too huge. It's just too huge, and it was happening at the same time as Stalingrad, which is what everybody in the world was paying attention to. So as a result, this medal is relatively inexpensive and very easily available to collectors. It's not really seriously speaking, faked, not at this point anyway. You can get an original piece for a song almost.
Wow.
So now to the medal itself. How does it look? What's on it? And if there are any variations, I guess I would want to know.
All right, yeah. Let's take a peek.
So to actually get to the point of how the medal looks, what's on it, this is the first version of the medal.
Okay.
And you can see that the design is busier than most other Soviet medals of this kind. If you remember how medal for defense of Leningrad, for example, looks, it's just a line of defenders, one landmark, Admiralty spire on the background, and there is really not much of anything else. Same thing with Stalingrad, line of defense, same thing pretty much with defense of Sevastopol or defense of Odessa. There is really not much, just one central point, say Navy sailor in case of Sevastopol. There's really not much else on it. On defense of Caucasus medal, there's really a lot going on. And maybe that's because of the vastness of the area and the importance of the area. You can see, for example, how the medal, unlike most other Soviet medals, practically all, got a very fancy border. And this border consists of grapes, of grape wines, which signifies that it's a verdant area, very important for agricultural production in general, and actually producing very good wines. By the way, Stalin was from the Caucasus. He was a big fan of that wines. Here it says for the defense of Caucasus, and you can see the mountains, the mountain ridge. Very importantly, look at what's on the background behind the tanks and this rugged terrain, oil derricks, signifying the importance of Caucasus as the oil production center of the Soviet Union. Nothing else even came close.
Wow.
And you see tank-borne infantry. We'll discuss that in some detail because there lies a curious detail that most people don't know about. And on the back, just like any other Soviet campaign medal, it says for the defensive campaign, it says for our Soviet motherland, hammer and sickle, of course. This is variation 1, which is identified very easily by this eyelet, which is a separate part. It's a soldered to the rest of the medallion. On the later versions of the medal, eyelet is part of the strike, of the overall strike, part of the medallion that was made together with the medallion, struck together with the medallion. Here's another variation 1, just as an example. And as you can imagine, because of the vastness of the campaign, the medal is quite common, and it's a real bargain as far as World War II campaigns go.
Yes.
870,000 issued. Most of them were actually variation 1. So the earlier version of the medal is by far the more common of the 3 major versions. You can see, I might have mentioned this in one of the earlier episodes, you can see some of the, what people call gilt, but it's really just a shine left by the strike in the recesses, this shiny area that looks like gold. It's not really gold, it's not gold-plated. It's just the mint luster. This is what you want to see on all the regional medals. And by the way, medal in general, medal for the defense of Caucasus, is a great study example. If you want to get a feel for how a Soviet medal should look, if you are suspicious about some rare medal that's being offered to you, like Odessa, look at the medal for the defense of Caucasus first. Compare them.
Yes.
Compare it with the rare ones. It should follow the same kind of idea. It should have the same kind of quality. It should have the same mint luster on the background, the same quality of details, the same kind of eyelet. There was no difference. Same width, same overall look, same kind of sorter. Sometimes there is more width, sometimes there is less. But overall, and this is why I'm showing several examples, you expect to see pretty much the same sort of things on any Soviet campaign medal of the same vintage. I'm talking about variation 1. There are some differences in the suspension device. It can be steel, it can be made in brass, like this one here. It's always double-sided on original suspensions. Regional suspensions are always made of 2 layers. You see this little connection between the 2 layers. If you look at the edge, it consists of 2 plates that are joined together. And the pin on original World War II suspensions is always self-locking. What I mean by that, you see how the pin has a hook that's part of the pin on the other side?
Right.
And you just pull it down and hook it from underneath. And this is how the medal is attached to a uniform or a civilian jacket. You puncture a hole, you put this needle through the hole in the jacket, and then you fasten it here. Like this. Some of suspensions may have a maker mark. That's pretty uncommon. So that would be a desirable kind of thing.
Yes, maker mark.
Maker mark on the suspension device. Because the Mint didn't produce everything. They produced the medallions, but suspensions themselves were subcontracted.
Oh, okay.
To
Different
producers. So this is all about variation 1 medal. Variation 2, just like any other variation 2 campaign medal, it's very easy to distinguish. It has this peculiar looking eyelet, which is struck together with a medal. Now it's not a separate part anymore. It's a part. It's one intrinsic part, one piece with the medallion.
I see.
We won't see any sorter here. And the shape of this eyelet may differ slightly. Like here, it's more U-shaped, but very typical.
Oh yes, okay, yeah, that's different.
Slightly different, but
yeah.
overall the same idea. And finally, variation 3 that I won't spend much time on right now. It's the one that is so-called veterans version, where it's still one-piece construction. The eyelet is more rounded, more kind of streamlined, and that one is actually more scarce than either variation 2 or especially variation 1. But when I talk about medal for the defense of Caucasus, I must mention one particular version that is very obscure. And you may be lucky enough to just find it at the Militaria show, or maybe offered by a dealer without the seller knowing that this is a rare version.
Yes.
And this is a very rare version that I'm talking about of the variation 1.
Yes.
And most Soviet medals were made using the same die. So in case of medals that are not so common, if they only produce 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, in most instances, this one single die was enough to produce the required number of medals. So there are really no variations in how the die looks. And that's great because you can tell if the medal is original by comparing the little intricacies of the die. If you don't find them, then something is off.
Yes.
So it's very difficult for that reason to fake. This defense of Caucasus, because of huge number produced against 870 or so thousand issued, and most of them variation 1, it was probably necessary at some point to rejuvenate the die, change the die entirely. And what we have here, as a result, is a very rare version of the same medal, still variation 1. It's no different from any other variation 1, except for one very peculiar detail. If you look at the young-born infantry riding on a tank here, you'll notice that they carry what looks like little sticks, which represents rifles.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
Look at this.
So they carry rifles.
Behind this guy, this last guy sitting on a tank, you can kind of see it here too and here too.
Yeah, we see it.
You won't see it on a regular version. And I use a very nice example where all the details are very clear.
Oh, the rifles.
You won't find the rifles on the most common version, one.
That's right, rifleless, unarmed.
Sort of. So it's very important, therefore, to pay attention to this little detail. Here's another one, no rifles.
Right, unarmed again.
Unarmed.
They're going to war
weaponless. And with the other one, very clearly.
Okay.
You see?
There we go.
Sticks.
There we go. Yeah, lines representing rifles.
Rifles, yes. So if you're lucky enough to find one, just grab it. Absolutely. It's about 10 times, 20 times more rare.
Oh, no kidding.
The common version.
And what kind of prices are we talking about?
Good question. For a regular version in really fantastic condition, something like what we have here. Like, look at how beautifully it's preserved.
Yeah.
It's original suspension. And by the way, it's marked, which is a bonus.
Oh, yes.
Oh, here's another example of beautifully preserved metal.
Yes.
Here you have choices, and I would say absolutely go for the best one you can get, because the price difference is negligible. You're expected to pay maybe $80 tops. That's what we have on the really fantastic, magnificent example. You can find them for much less. Places like eBay, if it's it has a lot of tarnish, if it has a lot of wear, you can possibly get it for $30 or $40.
Wow.
But then, why bother, quite frankly?
Sure.
You want to have the best. Prices are so low anyway.
Yes.
The ones that are later versions, maybe a little bit more, but not by far, because most collectors just want to have, if they want to have one medal for the defense of Caucasus, they just want to have the early version, which happens to be the least expensive and most available of the bunch.
I see.
So even the second or third version will not cost you all that much. They'll definitely be under 100. As far as the one with rifles, it's probably going to be about 120, maybe as much as double the price of the regular one. So in comparable condition, if it were minty like this one, you'll probably be selling for something like $125 dollars. It's in very nice shape. It's not perfect. It does have a little bit of oxidation, like little spot here, some tarnish on the back, although not much. Details happen to be very nicely, very nicely preserved.
Very good value. Very good value.
So here you have it, an uncommon version of very important, of a medal for very important World War II campaign.
Yes.
And look, it's It's going to cost you much more than 100. Now, we cannot, we do have to mention documents if we are talking about the medals. Yes. And just very briefly, this is how typical document for Medal for the Defense of Caucasus looks. 1, 2, 3. All three, you will notice, were issued by military units. Each shows the name of recipient, and if they were issued during the war, if the person was still on active duty, like what we have here, October 1944, May 45, still an active duty serviceman. This one is 17 August 1945, still an active duty for serviceman. It shows the rank. Here, recipient is red Navy private or seaman, enlisted man, junior lieutenant in this case, and finally engineer captain. Wow. So captain of engineers. It mentions what unit issued the award. Typically, it says here it was anti-aircraft regiment, for example, railway troops unit, and here the one who signed it actually was a very high-ranking guy, lieutenant general, deputy commander of a front.
Yeah, his original signature.
His original signature, so this one is more interesting for that reason. But all three look very much alike. There is a stamp of military unit. Sometimes it's very faint, but it should correspond with the rank and position of the person who signed the document. This is your standard format for early Soviet campaign certificates. Later, that format changed and became a booklet format. So you cannot have both. So the document for a particular medal, the particular medal, must be of one format only. So for Caucasus, it's always the single-page certificate, has nothing on the back. Always have a serial number, and this is the serial number of the certificate. You'll notice the serial number is always different. Each person has individual serial number.
Sometimes they're folded.
And usually they're folded because there was no other way to carry them.
Right.
So they would be folded in four typically. Sometimes they develop breaks, separations along the fold lines especially. Sometimes they get repaired. These ones that we have here are in very nice condition. Better than average by far. Don't have any stains, not much damage. Dog ears and so forth.
And how much are the documents selling for?
Again, very inexpensive, in the area of $50, $60.
Not bad.
Not bad.
Not bad
70. If it's something interesting, there were some documents that were issued by civilian authorities, especially at the end or after the war, and they differed by region, like regional authorities would issue a medal, and that document had a slightly different format, same size, same overall format, but different kind of writing, typographically printed writing at the bottom. It would be by civilian authority. Those are worth more depending on what region, what specific area issued them. But your standard military issue Caucasus document, very affordable and easily obtainable.
Very nice. Very nice. Wow.
So that's your bargain of Soviet military.